The US Coast Guard says its mission to find a missing submersible in the North Atlantic remains a search and rescue operation despite still not knowing where the vessel is. Experts say they remain hopeful of finding the 5 people who disappeared as they descended to the wreck of the Titanic on Sunday. Remotely operated vehicles, ships and aircraft are involved in the continuous search. Noises have also been heard during the search, but Captain Jamie Frederick says they don't know what they are.
We're searching in the area where the noises were detected. And when we're able to get additional ROVs, which will be there in the morning, the intent will be to continue to search in those areas where the noises were detected.
Well, within the last few minutes, Sean Leat, co-founder and chairman of the Horizon Maritime Services, has been speaking at a press conference.
I want to say first that our thoughts and focus remain with the crew of the Titan and their families. We wish to thank everyone involved in this rescue mission, especially the U.S. and Canadian Coast Guards, the organizations that have made their marine assets available.
A man's in a critical condition after 2 people were stabbed at a hospital in northwest London. Armed police were called to the central Middlesex in Brent at around lunchtime. The incident is not being treated as terror-related and a man has been arrested. The Prime Minister has rejected claims the government is responsible for a mortgage catastrophe. Rishi Sunak insists ministers are on track to continue reducing inflation, despite the Consumer Prices Index remaining at 8.7%. Investment Director at the UK's largest asset manager, Aberdeen, Luke Hickmore, has told LBC it will push up interest rates.
This is the harshness of economics, to change the inflation background, to stop those price rises and actually try and maybe even get to the point where they start reversing to some degree. There's going to be pain.
At least 24 people have been injured after a suspected gas explosion in central Paris. 270 firefighters have been trying to put out the flames. And Jose Mourinho has been handed a 4-match ban by UEFA after he was filmed abusing English referee Anthony Taylor. It happened after his side Roma were beaten by Sevilla in the Europa League final last month. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 10 points at 75.59. The pound buys $1.27 and €1.16. LBC weather, any showers clearing to leave a dry night across the UK, a low of 7 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. This is Cross Question.
I'm Ali Miraj. You're listening to and watching LBC, and it's time for Cross Question. It's 8:03, and I'm joined by a really stellar panel this evening. To my left is Joanne Nadler, the author and political commentator. Also to my left, actually politically for once as well, is Parmjit Dhanda, the former Labour MP, who is also a former minister and is now part of the Back Heathrow campaign. On my right, Jonathan Gullis, who is a Conservative MP and also a former secondary school teacher. And further to the right is Mandu, Reid, leader of the Women's Equality Party. So lots to get our teeth into tonight. You might want to ask about what we were discussing in the last hour, those inflation numbers at 8.7%. You might also want to ask about the announcement, or at least the reporting, that Keir Starmer might appoint up to 90 peers, despite saying that he wanted to abolish the House of Lords. How does that work? Also, a huge increase in the number of teenage girls with eating disorders, and President Biden, calling President Xi a dictator. Not a great look when you've just had your Secretary of State going to visit that very man. And remember, anything else on your mind, feel free to ask our panel, and don't forget to watch us live on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question. Watch on Global Player. This is LBC.
Let's go to our first question, which comes from James in Chelsea. Good evening, James.
Hi, good evening, Ali. Good evening, panel. How much success has Rishi Sunak had in bringing down inflation and the small boats crossing? Because, as I understand it, 10 days ago it was 7,200. We're now over 10,000 within 10 days. So how successful has he been?
Well, it carries on our conversation for the last hour on the mid-year appraisal of the Prime Minister. Jonathan Gullis.
Well, if I start first of all with the small boats, the legislation that he's brought before the House, the illegal migration bill, is really tough, robust, is going further than anyone ever expected. And I was delighted to work with colleagues to make sure that we can really allow our UK domestic courts, of course, to challenge it. But most importantly, these Rule 39 orders that were never past the original European Convention of Human Rights can be ignored because they're not legally binding, and we can actually get those flights to Rwanda to act as a deterrent. He's also had success with the Albania scheme in particular. We've seen a major drop, 90% drop in the amount of Albanians attempting to make this journey, and having obviously sent back about 1,800 both illegal migrants and foreign national offenders to Albania is progress. But ultimately, the Prime Minister did make it clear with all these pledges to judge him at the end of 2023. And I think once we've got the legislation through the court system, once we've obviously got the Rwanda scheme taking off, once we complete that cooperation even further with our neighbours in France, then we can actually start to see results in that space. In terms of inflation, look, the headline figure has come down. We are at 8.7%. Food inflation actually, yes, small, but did actually come down by a small amount. But of course, understand that core inflation has risen. That's obviously a major concern for people up and down this country. But the Prime Minister, therefore, is absolutely right to dedicate and make that his top priority, because it's inflation that makes us poorer.
But Jonathan, you talk about the small boats, and even the Home Secretary Suella Braverman said only the other day that the target of reducing the asylum backlog would potentially not be met because there are more and more people coming here and there simply aren't enough staff to process the claims.
Well, this is the challenge that we've got to face, which is why we have to do everything we can to deter people from choosing to put thousands of pounds in the hands of smuggling gangs to make that illegal and unnecessary journey across the English Channel, to stop these smugglers trading in human misery, which is totally unnecessary. And in places like Stoke-On-Trent, which has 1,279 asylum seekers, refugees and illegal migrants within our city, taking up our hotels, which means people have lost their jobs, undermining levelling up projects right by Stoke-on-Trent railway station, putting further strain on the school and healthcare system that we have in our local authority area, as well as the Stoke-on-Trent taxpayer carrying the burden yet again. That's something why I've been well known to be speaking about this issue, and something that I firmly believe that we can deliver on.
OK, Mandu, Reid, has Rishi Sunak got any track record to speak of?
I think it's interesting, Jonathan, you point to judging Rishi Sunak at the end of the year, but essentially we have to look at the direction of travel. And if we're talking about inflation, if the direction of travel suggests sluggishness, suggests that whatever interventions he's tried to implement aren't having the desired effect, we can't allow more harm to result from the situation that was announced today. Inflation, the CPI figures were static. Yeah. And, the narrative that we've been fed over the last few months has been, this is due to global factors that are beyond our control. I really think that's past its sell-by date now, because when you look at what the situation is in Europe, their inflation figures are around 6%, significantly lower than ours. In the USA, around 4%, significantly lower than ours. And crucially, the direction of travel is that they are on the decline. And so actually, we have to look at what's going on here, how we're handling the situation domestically, and say to Rishi and say to Jeremy Hunt, what you're doing is not good enough and it's going to cause misery.
Mandu,
two factors.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Brexit is one factor. Yep. It's disrupted supply chains. Of course it has. Jonathan's shaking his head, but it has disrupted supply chains. It has increased import and export costs. That's not going to help. And then profiteering. In the context of a cost of living crisis, to have profiteering being undertaken. We've talked a lot about the energy producers, of course, but there's also big firms like Tesco's, for example, who have made gross profits in the last year of 4.6 billion. And gross is the operative word there when people are struggling to put food on the table. And you have more food banks in this country than branches of McDonald's.
Do you think there should be direct government intervention?
I do,
but
100%.
In which area?
I think you've got to look at finding sources of cash that can alleviate the problems. Households, mortgage holders, renters who feel the knock-on effect of those interest rate hikes that we're going to see tomorrow. Yeah. And a couple of sources. You can put a kind of windfall tax on some of these companies that are making gross profits on the back of people's misery, struggle and suffering. And you can also, do something that Conservative governments always shy away from doing, and address, for example, the income tax avoidance and evasion, which every year the HMRC tells us there's a tax gap of about 32 billion.
Understood.
So there are sources of cash that you can identify if you've got the backbone, and Rishi Sunak has shown himself to be a political invertebrate. And I don't think that's what we need right now if we're going to address these problems and help people.
A political invertebrate. Joanne Nadler.
I think the caller has identified a real big political problem for Rishi Sunak over and above the economics of this. A sort of odd lack of foresight over his strategy, which was to make great claims on both of these areas, on the small boats and on the rate of inflation.
Did he not have to, Joanne, though, when he started?
Two things. First, sorry, I'm just turning down, if anyone's wondering what I'm doing under the table, I'm just turning down my earpiece because it was a bit too loud. He didn't necessarily have to promise to reduce them by the end of this year. That limits his scope to a certain extent. And he didn't need to claim that this is something that the government, certainly as far as the inflation rate is concerned, had so much direct control over, because we know it doesn't. And therefore he has created a sort of a false expectation almost. Now, I think there is a huge question about the legitimacy of the extent to which we've moved in this country over the last 25 years towards having this hands-off approach to managing monetary policy, and the extent to which I think that, as a consequence, and I think Rishi Sunak is found wanting in this regard, politicians have been very reluctant to criticise the Bank of England. But there's a democratic accountability here, and it's coming back in a sense to haunt Rishi Sunak, who you're right, in a sense, he had to say that this was going to be his priority. But if he's going to be bold and ambitious about that, and to put inflation at the centre of his financial strategy, his economic strategy, then he also has to admit that the government ability to pull at levers is somewhat limited.
Do you think that the independence of the Bank of England should be revoked?
Well, I was never really in favour of it in the first place. I understand the logic about it being there to sort of get round boom and bust. But, my political credo is essentially about democracy and accountability. And I think it takes that out of the system because it removes from governments whom we elect this fundamental ability to affect the economic outcome.
Okay, Parmjit, what do you make of Rishi Sunak's record so far?
Well, I thought it was a really interesting point just at the end then about the independence of the Bank of England. It was the first thing the Labour government did in 1997.
Hit the ground running. Right. Yeah.
And we did have so many quarters, in fact, of growth right the way through to 2008 when the banking collapse happened. We had growth every quarter. So I think taking the politics out of it did actually help. But in terms of where we're at, and I think there's a lot of smoke and mirrors out there. There's a lot of chaff being thrown up by the government at the moment. And from your listeners' perspective, look, inflation is really high. 19% on food is hurting people. Huge. Energy prices are crippling. The interest rates, which we may well come on to as well, now £2,900 per household on average. And this didn't just happen. This is largely as a consequence to the fun and games, Jonathan, I'm afraid, that have been going on in your party. People knifing each other in the back, one prime minister after another. And then we came to that kamikaze budget where the government borrowed £45 billion to give tax cuts to the very richest people by taking away that 50p rate. It lifted the cap on bankers' bonuses. It sent out all the wrong messages at that budget. And it's small wonder that the pound fell against the dollar to the largest amount it ever has in recorded history. And off the back of that, we've got inflation. Off the back of that, we've got high interest
rates. What about Rishi, though? In terms of the Prime Minister now, Rishi Sunak, he came in on the back of that. How do you think he is doing against his own pledges?
He set himself not that hard a target, to be honest. And as I think it's been mentioned already, he's not really achieving what he needs to achieve. I mean, we've got the figures out today. It's stayed stubborn at the same level. It hasn't gone down at all, which is very, very worrying for anybody listening to this show or watching this show today who has a mortgage, because big decisions to be made.
Absolutely.
But also, the smoke and mirrors also applies equally to what's being said around the boats. I think you mentioned it, Ali, a moment ago, in terms of you can't have an immigration policy that talks big, is very showy, will stop the small boats, but you're not investing in the Home Office in terms of removals. 135,000 people waiting to hear their claims, over 90,000 going back over 6 months.
Well, it's not even only that, Jonathan, but the Conservative Party, I thought, had a policy of trying to reduce migration, particularly after Brexit. 606,000. What on earth has happened here?
Well, look, I think Parmjit did an excellent job of pitching to be one of those 90 peers that go into the House of Lords under Keir Starmer, and I hope he's tuning in and listening and making note of what a great job there's been. At least,
if you lose your seat, you might join us.
Well, if that's it, I'll take that endorsement, absolutely. I will say one thing though, whenever you think of the Prime Minister's plans, those 5 pledges that he made to the people, at the very least, those are concrete things that the voters of this country understand, rather than the constant flip-flopping and U-turning from Keir Starmer that we see day in, day out, pivoting from pillar to post, because ultimately he just wants to try and force some sort of idea of what he thinks the country wants, rather than actually putting forward what he actually believes. And this is therefore a reason why people are unable to trust Keir Starmer when I hear on doorsteps. And we saw even with the £28 billion a year they were going to borrow for this for the green industry, and then obviously Rachel Reeves killed that off
but they're
overnight.
Being responsible, aren't they?
Very responsible.
Rachel Reeves will claim to be responsible. The fact that they're making unfunded borrowing commitments and then having to be put on the naughty step, as Ed Miliband was, by Rachel Reeves. But the problem is, because Keir Starmer has U-turned that many times, who is to say that Keir Starmer won't then try and bring that policy back in if he's in government?
Jonathan, have you considered they might be taking inspiration from Liz Truss on that? Sorry, anyway.
Liz Truss is no longer Prime Minister.
Indeed,
she is no longer Prime Minister, thank goodness. And I think, households around the country will be sighing a relief at that fact. But Rishi Sunak's got a real problem on his hands, because tomorrow, when we see the interest rates hike, there are 15 million households who are homeowners in this country. There are renters who are paying rent in order to pay off mortgages of homeowners' second homes. There's this huge constituency of people who are going to be looking at their home balance sheet, and they're going to be saying to Rishi, this is untenable. They're going to be saying to Rishi, what have we got? Repossessions up by 50%? We can't afford to find ourselves in Groundhog Day. We can't afford another crash. We can't afford for the bottom to fall out of our housing market in the way it did in the previous financial crisis. So I do think Rishi's in trouble, and it's partly a situation of the Tory party's making.
Well, we shall find out tomorrow when that interest rate decision comes as to how bad this is actually going to continue to get. So we're off to an interesting start here. If you want to get your question into our panel on Cross Question, you know what to do. Call 0345 60 60973. You can text on 84850, and also you can ask Alexa, who, as you know, is always very amenable to a request to send a comment to LBC followed by your question. You're watching Cross Question and listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:18.
This is LBC. Cross Question on LBC.
You're watching and listening to Cross Question on LBC. I'm Ali Miraj, and I'm joined by my stellar panel. Joanne Nadler, the commentator, Parmjit Dhanda, the former Labour MP and Minister, Jonathan Gullis, the Conservative MP, and Mandu, Reid from the Women's Equality Party, leader of the Women's Equality Party. Great panel. We're having an interesting discussion so far. Let's go to our next call from Clark in Oxford. Good evening, Clark.
There. I went to university with Parmjit. Hi to you. My question is this. I have a mortgage right now. It's realistic for the government to force my mortgage provider to allow me to extend my current mortgage at the current rate by 1 or 2 years to beat the interest rate hike.
OK, and just to put a bit of context around this, the Chancellor has ruled out any direct support for borrowers who can't afford the higher interest rates on this particular point. Your idea was also raised by Malcolm in Bodmin last night and also earlier this evening. Mandu, Reid.
I think it's a real shame that Jeremy Hunt has decided ahead of the meeting that he's advertised will be taking place on Friday with various lenders, that he's ruling out something that actually could make a difference, that could alleviate some of the pressures, that could prevent a further increase in the repossessions that we're seeing, the pressure households are under. I would like to see, at a time of crisis like this, a really open-minded approach being taken to the solutions that could make a difference, could reassure listeners at home who are really struggling with this, who are under huge pressure, but also, why would you, ahead of a summit like that, close things down? So again, I'm baffled as to why yesterday it was things that could make a difference are being ruled out.
Isn't it because, do you think it is because they do not want to send a message to the market that the government will intervene at every turn? I mean, furlough was a different issue, but this is a question of people taking personal responsibility and decisions themselves, and the government can't bail out everyone on their mortgages.
Yes, but government interventions required when there's market dysfunction. Government intervention is required when the market is delivering suboptimal outcomes. And when you have families, is it good for our economy overall to find ourselves in a situation where you are getting a domino effect of people not being able to keep up their mortgage payments, repossessions take place, people descending into poverty? Who actually benefits from that? I just don't understand this aversion to taking preemptive action that could shore us up. I hear commentators talk all the time about stability and how that's the most crucial thing to kind of keep things level-headed as far as our market goes. And so I'm afraid we need a more interventionist approach in the context.
Spoken like a true LSE graduate. Spoken like a true. As am I there. Fair point.
You sussed me out.
Indeed. Joanne Nadler.
I think Clark asked whether the government should have a role in effectively telling mortgage companies how to renegotiate individual contracts. And I think responsible mortgage companies will want to do that with their clients, because ultimately they do want to receive their money back. It's not in their best interests to have clients defaulting on their mortgages, and that shouldn't really be a requirement of government. I mean, I slightly absolutely sympathise with people that are in the midst of this. And I mean, not only sympathise, I empathise. My mortgage has more than doubled over the last year. But I slightly take issue with some of Mandu's language, because I don't think that this is a market dysfunction. If anything, I think this is the market finally asserting itself over what has been a very prolonged period of effective market management and intervention that has led to this crisis. That has led to that. Sorry, I'm going to rephrase that. I'm not sure in every sense it is a crisis. It is certainly a crisis for individuals in this facing the mortgage mortgage hikes. Although if you've got money invested, if you're a pensioner, you may be quite relieved that interest rates are finally returning to the sort of historical levels that we have more that we've expected over a longer term cycle. My point is, sorry, just to finish off,
of course,
that we've had 20-25 years or more now of effectively deficit financing and very, very cheap money that's been thrown at people in a very irresponsible way, both by the financial sector and with the endorsement of governments. And this is where governments have very much, I think, been found wanting and are hugely culpable in where we are now. But to add to that, further intervention, I think what we're dealing with now is a final proper correction. And actually, where I have quite a lot of respect for Rishi Sunak is, one, that he's identified that inflation has to be the main target, and two, that thus far he hasn't actually capitulated over further market interventions and sort of tinkering around with mechanisms. You occasionally hear him talk about, it seems to me, rather daft ideas like imposing price controls in supermarkets, let's say. I think that's gone away, thankfully. But over the wider economy, no, he's right to speak.
He's right not to intervene. Parmjit?
I'm enjoying the yin and yang here between Mandu and Joanna. I think
that's why we're opposite.
It's really keep them apart.
Very high quality points.
Firstly, I should say, good to hear from you, Clark. If I owe you a drink from Nottingham University days, do let me know. You can follow me on social media. Sad week, serious point for all of us that did go to Nottingham University as well.
Yeah, of course.
But on this question, I think a lot of my generation were kind of politicised around the time when the Conservatives were in and interest rates actually hit 15%. There were 1,000 repossessions a week. And I remember when Labour came in and they hit their first real financial problems around 2008, 2009, the banking crash. Gordon was Prime Minister and he was very, very interventionist in this. And we were really proud of that. I mean, in terms of the measures that he took. And a lot of it was kind of, didn't need stuff encased in law, but it was a relationship with lenders. We're not leaving anyone behind. We're not letting people lose their homes over this. If that means extending periods of mortgage or mortgage holidays for that period. And we all had data as constituency MPs that we were working with ministers over. And I can honestly say I don't know of anyone in Gloucester that lost their home in that period of time. But also, at the time, job losses were high and bringing business and trade unions together. And we even had flexibility around working weeks to just keep people in work rather than people being laid off. And sometimes governments do have to do that. So if I was Rishi, I wouldn't be taking things off the table.
Interesting. So you think you're calling for a measured but more interventionist approach?
If that's what it takes to keep people in their own homes and in work, in the long run, we found it was the best thing to do.
Jonathan Gullis, Rishi Sunak should be more interventionist.
Well, look, one of the things that I think Jeremy should make very clear when he meets with the banks, for example, the mortgage lenders, is totally outrageous that they are hiking up the interest very quickly to make money. We've seen reports of around £5 billion. But that is not being passed on to savers in any way, shape or form. And we should go back to what Margaret Thatcher put on the table, which is if you don't start looking after your customers, those humans who have got their dream of owning their own home, who've worked really hard to save up and have that slice of ownership that they maybe never thought they'd have, then we will windfall tax you and we'll introduce an old Myra style scheme, something I wrote about today in the Eye, because I think ultimately, I'm pleased you read it. And I think, look, for me, it's not something I want to do. I don't think it's right that government has to intervene. But at the moment, what I'm seeing is bad capitalism from the banks, which undermines an economic model that I'm very supportive of, because I think it actually helps to drive growth, create wealth in our country, and relies on the system of, hard work gets you the reward.
Jonathan, I mean, the thing about bad capitalism is we simply don't have enough competition in the market. We had that absolute horrendous financial crash. And great promises here and across the Atlantic that, banking would be liberated, that we'd have a lot of small providers coming into the marketplace. And that really hasn't happened. We're still seeing effectively, big names dominating this market. So I'm not, that is the kind of regulation that we require. We need, free up the market, create more competition.
But I think just last point. I mean, you talk about the market asserting itself and there being a correction, etc. But what about the human cost of that? And if the human cost of that is going to drive more households and more children into poverty, more children on free school meals, etc., etc., what we're creating is a much bigger problem, which will require even more significant, I believe, government intervention to solve further down the line.
Can I just ask you?
I'm saying that crash was going to come, a break was going to come, and it's better that we reorientate the whole economy to cope with that than to continue to create the circumstances in which we are spending far more than the country can afford.
Let me ask you this very brief question before we go to a break, and I'm very, very brief, but I just want to ask you this. So this has come in from a text question from David in Newbury. Should the governor of the Bank of England be writing his resignation tonight? Resignation letter, I suppose, or maybe it's an email or a tweet. I don't know. It's all modern these days. Should he be writing his resignation letter tonight rather than thinking about an announcement on interest rates tomorrow morning?
I'm not sure what that would help or who that would help. So I don't know.
Okay, Jonathan?
I think the governor of the Bank of England's got a lot of questions to answer. I'm certainly not a fan, and I wouldn't be sad to see him go, but I think that that would just be some short-termism and rather than actually dealing with the reality on the ground right now.
Mandu's been more charitable. Okay. Parmjit.
How many resignations do we need? We've had so many of them. I can't remember the number of prime ministers we've lost.
Indeed, Joanne.
I think bring back Mervyn King.
Well, he's quite happy lecturing the LSE and writing books and stuff these days. But who knows? You heard it here first. Mervyn King should come back, says Joanne Nadler. It's an interesting, high quality, as you can see, cross-question panel this evening. I mean, it's all very high level.
By the way, my answer to the last question was to resign.
Okay, fair enough. You can see Parmjit wants to be in a future government. He knows which way to play these things. If you want to get a question,
I'd fail the medical.
If you want to get a question into our cross question panel, you know what to do. 0345 606 0973. You can text on 84850. You can ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. You're watching and listening to Cross Question on LBC at 8:32. The news headlines with Daryl Jackson.
The US Coast Guard says the mission to find the missing submersible that disappeared while heading down to the Titanic remains a search and rescue operation. Officials involved also don't know what's causing noises that are being picked up around the wreckage, but they're searching in that part of the Atlantic. A man has been arrested after two people were stabbed at a hospital in northwest London. The central Middlesex was locked down at one point and armed officers were deployed. And at least 24 people have been injured after a suspected gas explosion in central Paris. 270 firefighters have been trying to put out the flames. LBC weather, any showers clearing to leave a dry night across the UK and a low of 7 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
You're watching and listening to Cross Question. It's 8:35. I'm Ali Miraj. I'm joined by my panel, Joanne Nadler, the writer and political commentator. Joanne, we've spoken on many panels before together, and I wanted to. You've also written a book, including one, "Too Nice to Be a Tory. It's my party, and I'll cry if I want to." Maybe we should all be crying again now with the state that the party's in. Your party's in at the moment. But you also have been talking about talking out against politicisation in schools. What's that about?
Well, I think it's something that this week has very much come into the forefront, hasn't it? About these various extraordinary cases of gender identity and indeed other types of
animal identity, cats, the furries.
And it's no laughing matter, to be honest, that are now being exposed as happening widely in schools. I've just written a long form pamphlet for a think tank called Civitas, really looking at where all of this has come from. And I would also commend people to parents particularly, but also concerned teachers to look at the report that came out from the new Social Covenant Unit and from Policy Exchange earlier this year about the extent and spread of sort of radical ideologies within schools.
Well, we might be touching on that, and I'll look forward to reading it. Now, Parmjit, former Labour MP and Minister, now an executive at the Back Heathrow campaign. I've got to declare an interest here. Parmjit and I were both elected as councillors together in 1998 in Hillingdon. We're basically brothers. We're at that time on different sides of the political spectrum. But I've followed your career with great interest, Parmjit. Are you really champing at the bit to get back into politics? Because I think your country probably needs you at some point.
Did somebody once say something about rugby balls coming loose at the back of the scrum? Well, whatever happened to him?
It worked quite well for him.
What I will say.
Are you thinking to become Prime Minister?
Listen, I think I had a wonderful, wonderful time being a member of Parliament. It's just something in hindsight. Jonathan will back me up in this. The stuff that you can still do as a constituency MP. I still have the tear-stained letters from a couple that were separated in different care homes at Christmas and making sure that they were together. Stuff like that. Okay. It's a huge thing. It's a wonderful thing, and I want more people to want to be MPs again.
Right. Well, you sound like you really are a politician. You need to be back in there. Jonathan, why do they call you Grumpy Gullis? You're always completely charming every time I see you.
Well, I made the fatal mistake of having a light-hearted interview, which has allowed ridicule. I basically had a really tough time when I was in my NQT year, my first qualified year as a teacher. I was at a school that I had already done some work at, and I thought I was quite popular, and I'd walk in and everyone would be really well behaved because they liked my lessons. Well, a harsh life lesson that was indeed. And when one of my old bosses, Lola Blatch, came in and said, "Toughen up," I created Grumpy Gullis, Mr. No Smiles, in order to really create the character I needed to get through and have the discipline in my lessons, so actually pupils could enjoy.
Very good.
Yeah, I try to smile more as I get older.
Very good. And Mandu, I was fascinated, as well as being an LSE grad, which all the best people are, of course. You also founded an NGO called Cup Effect. Can you just tell me?
This was a few years ago now, and the point of that charity was to raise awareness about period poverty, improve the education that is happening in schools at all levels, primary, secondary, in the UK and further afield, around menstruation and ways of handling and dealing with that. And this was prior to this being a subject that was widely understood. It was prior to the first time the word tampon was uttered in Parliament by Philip Hammond, which was as a result of some of our advocacy and campaigning. I was very proud of that moment.
I must go and watch that again. We'll look that up in Hansard. Perfect. Thank you very much indeed. So we've got a great panel. Let's go to our next text question from Doreen in Wakefield. How do we stop this worrying rise in eating disorders amongst young girls? Now, just to give you background here, GP's records from during the pandemic showed a big surge in teenage girls developing eating disorders and also self-harming. The biggest increases were in wealthier areas, but this could be simply because there is better access to GPs in those areas. Joanne?
Well, eating disorders and anorexia in teenage girls have generally been recognised as what we call a social contagion, which means there is an element of them being able to be caught, as it were, it spreads between girls of similar age. And it's interesting, your statistics, I think your question referred to it being particularly prevalent amongst was it middle class girls? I mean,
young girls.
Yeah,
young girls, particularly in COVID.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a sign of psychological stress, a sign, of, particularly amongst girls, of feeling uneasy about their physical development, about their burgeoning sexuality, and perhaps. I'm not a psychologist, so I'm going to be cautious in how I express this. The area that I've been most concerned about is the way in which the tendency for this for young girls to feel very uncomfortable in some ways about their puberty and their development seems to be now spreading into the aspect of gender identification as well, and that seems to also now be at a level where I think it's fair to describe it as a social contagion.
Yep.
As to what one does about eating disorders, I mean, that is very obviously extremely complex. I think nobody's surprised, frankly, that psychological stress and problems were exacerbated by the lockdown. Many of us felt that the lockdown was very ill-advised for all of the for the potential fallout of which this was sadly, predictably, one of them. But I think it has so much to do with, the prevalence of porn in our society.
Okay.
I mean,
sure.
Aspects.
Okay. I mean, just on this, just to give you a bit of background, this was looked at between 2020 and 2022. A study found, and they found that there were 3,862 actual observed cases of this, where the actual projection was 2,700. So it's even more than they thought. Parmjit, why is this happening?
Well, I think social media certainly plays a role in this.
Yeah,
it's everywhere. As a father of two young sons,
is this to be looking a certain way? Is that?
I think so. I think more, I know there's been a bill that's gone through Parliament recently as well, where they're actually looking towards social media companies and the stuff that they put out and that gets spread. But I think there is a lot of pressure on young people, boys and girls, but girls in particular, as you say. But the biggest killer of young men is actually suicide. So the pressure's out there. And the pressure's to look good, to fit an image, often by made up and rather puffed up images that appear on social media, I think puts an awful lot of pressure on young people.
I'd really like to see... It's fundamental than that, though, if you don't mind me saying. I think it's much more to do with... I know I had my fair share, but just to cut in there, if I may, I don't think it's so much about how one looks. I think it's about the capacity to regain control over a stressful situation. Now, in some cases, in some cases,
what I was going to say specifically is there's been huge cuts to the CAMS, the children and adolescents' mental health budgets over the years, and you used to be able to access those kinds of services through schools. And I do think it's one of the things that the next Labour government, which I hope is around the corner.
Sure. Mandu, I think you're going to have some views on this, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think the social contagion idea has limited utility when trying to understand this problem. And the fact that the spike that we're referring to took place during COVID gives us some clues that there are probably some other factors at play as well. I know that the reports that I read this morning also referred to a significant increase in girls of the age in question self-harming too. And I think when you're talking about eating disorders of this kind, self-harming, the source of that is self-esteem issues. The source of that is the status girls have in their schools, in the communities that they belong to. We know that, these are Ofsted figures, that 9 out of 10 girls in schools have experienced some form of sexual harassment, or they've received unwanted sexual images sent to them. And what that does I remember what it was like. I mean, I'm 42 now, so it's a while ago, but I do remember being 13, 14, 15. It's a really awkward time. And I think social media is an exacerbating factor, 100%. And also the point made about how the mental health services that could help girls, help families navigate this are so underfunded.
They are stretched.
They are on their knees. It's really difficult to, get girls the support they need to deal with the pressures of being a girl in the 21st century in the context of social media and massive spikes in misogyny and patterns around how that plays out in schools and in the community.
Absolutely. Jonathan?
Well, look, Ali, I was head of year as well as a teacher.
Of course.
So I dealt with the welfare of pupils, and I'm hearing from people who are in the classroom still today, the amount of pupils coming forward has just gone through the roof.
Why is that?
And I think a lot of it is that social isolation that came with the pandemic. I think that was a real problem. A lot of people would have been in homes that wouldn't have been adequate in some cases to be able to study, to be able to have space just for oneself at the best of times. Look, I've been quite open about my own mental health struggles in the past, and still to this day have my own therapy. I'm very lucky to be able to access that through my own funds, and and Parmjit is absolutely correct. I think the CAM situation is a disgrace, and that needs to, and everyone's sort of talking about it, but I'm not seeing enough being done about it. And what I will give the government credit for, to be fair, is there has been a £71 million investment into young people's mental health, which has now seen 35% of all pupils from 399 different teams being covered in schools with mental health teams. That's going to be positive because early detection is absolutely vital, but it also goes back to this idea of making sure that we teach young people that emotional resilience. We don't do enough of that in our schools, and that's certainly something I want to see going forward.
I think emotional resilience is a very important point. I think that definitely is part of the equation. If you want to still get your question into our cross-question pan, you've still got a few minutes to do that. Don't be shy. Get it in. 03456060973. You can also text on 84850 or ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. You're watching and listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:47.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
12 months of industrial action from rail companies. General Secretary of the RMT, Mick Lynch. Diama is in Croydon.
Do you think that if all the unions get together, you would have a stronger case?
People have got to rise up to make their...
So is that what we need now? Union collaboration?
I'm going to the TUC straight after this meeting. We need coordination. We need to have a wave of protest. It needs to be against poverty.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player, LBC.
In a
Cross Question on LBC. Text 84850.
Welcome back. You're watching and listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:50. Our next question is a text question from Brian in South Shields. I thought the Labour Party wanted to abolish the Lords. Now I read Starmer wants to fill it with his allies. Is he a massive hypocrite? Parmjit Dhanda.
Why have you come to me?
Lord,
listen,
Lord
this is you've obviously heard something I haven't. That's
you should be the Lords. Go on.
Listen, I think this is a practical thing, really, because when you come into government, you have to get your legislation through the Commons, and then you have to get it through the Lords as well. And the Labour Party is actually the third largest group in the Lords. The Conservatives have far more peers. There are more crossbenchers than there are Labour peers. And then within all of that, you've got people who are ageing. It's not very representative of society. You've got hereditary peers are still there as well. Keir's been very clear on this. He does not want to keep the House of Lords as it is. He wants to see it reformed and changed. And I'm all for that. But he knows in order to be able to do that, he needs to be able to get his legislation through. He wants to get his changes through should Labour win the next general election. Let's not be too presumptuous. And the only way that he can do that is get it through the Lords as well as the Commons.
Jonathan's itching to get in. Is Starmer a hypocrite,
Well,
Jonathan?
I think he is. And I think there's actually something very simple here to go back to Parmjit's point, which is there is the Salisbury Convention, where if Keir Starmer puts everything he wants to do in his manifesto, regardless of the political makeup of the House of Lords, they do not have a right to block the government programme. They can certainly probe, they can certainly make...
They can slow it down.
They can slow it down, but they don't have a right to block it. And so if Keir Starmer has a really clear plan, something we'd all be grateful for finally, then ultimately the House of Lords will let it go through, it pretty much intact, unless Keir Starmer's telling us that he's going to give us a nice vague manifesto with no real promises, and then everything he actually wants to do, or is dreaming of doing, like his 10 pledges when he became leader and ditched, in Mr. Flip-Flop fashion as he is.
Just on that.
Will therefore be caught out.
Just on that, I think you've already alluded to the real problem here, which is the level of jiggery pokery in politics, regardless of how clear the manifesto is. There is plenty of scope for a few people to cause enough disruption to delay legislation.
Indeed. Jiggery pokery, a technical term there. Mandu, what do you make of this? Is he a hypocrite, Starmer, on this?
I think the more important point here is how the public feel about politics, the level of trust in politics. It's at rock bottom, as far as I'm concerned. And I think the last thing we need is a situation where people are making promises and turning their back on those promises before they've even got their feet under the table. I think what that does is it creates a real fatigue amongst people who are
They're all the same?
Yeah, who are watching politics. I do understand the pragmatism. I do. You know what? If I was in his shoes, I can kind of see the logic behind.
You can see the case for Parmjit being.
I can. But I think we have to look at the state of our politics, the state of our democracy, and really desperately try and avoid things that are going to undermine that further.
Understood. Joanne?
He may be a hypocrite. I don't really care, frankly, in the sense that I would just hope that we'll be saved from further ill thought through Labour constitutional change. This is something they offer because it doesn't actually cost them anything to offer these kind of changes. But, we've had our constitution ripped to pieces during the Blair period. And, if he goes back on wanting to scrap the House of Lords, then all for the better. I think.
What, the written constitution that we don't have?
We don't have a written constitution.
So how has it been ripped to pieces?
Well, it's been ripped to pieces because it's been reformed. We've seen, essentially we've seen Britain broken up into separate parts. We've seen the introduction of unaccountable layers of added bureaucracy. We've seen the introduction of a Supreme Court, which basically takes accountability away from the House of Lords. I mean, it's
and we've seen Parliament prorogued, and we've seen all sorts of shenanigans,
which was absolutely
exactly,
which was within the Constitution.
We need less.
It was prorogued in order to make sure that the will of the people was followed through.
It's getting spicy.
I think we agree that we need to see less of the kind of intervention that's going to further undermine people's confidence and trust in politics from whichever
by delivering on what they vote for.
Okay, you see, it's getting sparky. It's getting very sparky on this particular point. Maybe Sakir wants to dial in to calm things down. Let's see. There's another.
Certainly put us to sleep, I suppose.
I thought this topic might have come up. Now, Chris in Stubbington. Good evening, Chris. What would you like to ask the panel?
Hello. Good evening. What did the panel make of the teacher of Reigate School telling 2 students off for questioning gender identity and identifying as cats.
Okay, so this is a 13-year-old girl and a friend were called despicable by their teacher at Rye College in East Sussex last week when they refused to accept that their classmate identifies as a cat. The government is believed to have ordered an investigation into this school and whether pupils' safety is being put at risk there. Seems an utterly bizarre story to me. Jonathan Gullis, you're a former secondary school teacher. What on earth's going on?
I think it's despicable that a teacher would impose their viewpoint and an extremist viewpoint that has prevailed on Twitter upon young people who have every right to question and challenge and also have their own views and opinions. And I say this as someone who, I'm sure more pupils disagree with my politics that I used to teach than agree with them. But ultimately, I am very concerned that we've got into this debate about what is truth, and ultimately that some people think their truth is the truth for everyone, rather than actually understand that some things like science cannot and should not be debated. A woman is a woman, a biological female, someone who has body parts that I will never be able to possess. I will never be able to have children, for example. And the idea that we're pushing this nonsense that somehow a trans woman, for example, is a woman is terrifying. It's causing mental health issues in society, and it's also undermining the very basics, as I say, of biology, something that we haven't contested for millennia. If we dig up a skeleton from the ground, we can tell from that alone whether it's male or female. And then we have teachers now pushing this nonsense upon young people to say that they're despicable because they called out one of their pupils for saying they identify as a cat. This is not what schools are about, and it's wrong.
Mandu?
I think this is an example of a story that is, forgive me, catnip to the controversialists, for the people who...
But it still happened. They're not denying.
It certainly happened, but even the woman who was quoted in the Mail today from the Safer Schools Alliance acknowledged that this is actually really rare. I think it needs to be dealt with locally. It needs to be dealt with in the schools. But let's put this in context here, right? There are 24,000-ish schools in England. There are 500,000 teachers in those schools. There are 9 million pupils. And there are issues around relationships and sex, sex and relationships education. There are struggles that teachers are having, that students are having, that parents are having, trying to navigate this. Zooming in on an example like this, blowing it out of proportion, does not help the kids in question. It doesn't help us move to a place where we can have a sensible conversation that resolves the issues that are obviously there and have been enduring and ongoing for certainly the last few years.
But Mandy, shouldn't the teacher have just said this is utterly ridiculous?
I think that's probably how I would have dealt with it. But I think, the teacher's done what she's done, and there's now going to be...
You think it's
going to be dealt with.
Understood, Joanne.
I'm not there to discipline the teacher. The head teacher is there to do that. And in an ideal situation, the parents, the kids, and the teaching staff would collaborate to resolve things like this when they emerge. But to pretend this is something that is happening across the board in our school system, I think is irresponsible and unhelpful.
Understood. Joanne?
To answer the question directly, the teacher involved, based on what we've heard, should be suspended pending a further investigation. We have seen teachers who have dared to question gender ideology in schools, who have dared to question the idea that they should be affirming and using pronouns for children which don't match their biological sex.
Ideology.
No, but can I?
As you
we have seen them. I do call it that. We have seen them. We have seen those teachers effectively barred from teaching. So if there's going to be an even playing field here, then certainly a further investigation needs to be held into this particular teacher. Mandu, I'm afraid I think you've missed the point here, in the sense that, yes, you're right. I think the cases of children identifying as animals or the moon, as it were, are probably few and far between.
Probably.
But what isn't few and far between is the spread of the wider underpinning ideology. And can I just say that when we did polling very recently, we found that 67% of 16 to 18-year-olds were being told in school that sex is assigned at birth.
Okay, we're running out of time. So, Parmjit,
this is obviously a rare and rather probably isolated event. And as a former education minister, I would never have, in those days, past comment on stuff unless I knew all of the facts, whether it involved bullying, what had happened, the extent to which things have happened.
Okay. So you're reserving judgment?
Yeah, I don't think. In some ways, this almost sounds like it's something whipped up to get people very excited.
I think there's definitely a path back to politics, Parmjit, from what very, very, very treading a very fine line. Okay, look.
Well, that's diplomacy. It's not necessarily politics. In politics, you have to have opinions.
Okay, fine.
But there's human beings involved here.
Okay.
Yes, there are vulnerable children involved who need safeguarding.
And we don't know the story behind this.
And that's why I prefaced in what I said is based on what we've heard here.
Fine. Joanne's these are very important matters. I'm sure they will continue. Let's take the temperature down a little bit to end with our fun question, which is from Manira in Hackney, which is this: scientists say regularly taking naps is good for our brains and delays aging by several years. What do you do to keep hold of feeling youthful? Mandu?
I don't think it's working, but what I started doing in the pandemic is growing mushrooms.
Oh!
Yeah, because, we live in this Amazon Prime culture where everything is so quick fix and whatever. But when you grow your mushrooms, you've got to just create the right conditions.
These are edible mushrooms, for clarity.
Oh, yes, excuse me.
Yeah, okay,
absolutely
sorry.
Edible mushrooms.
Yeah, just to be clear.
Not hallucinogenic. Can I just be clear? No, but there's something very soothing about allowing and waiting. And when you're patient... You get to enjoy the fruits of your patience. And I think we need more of that in politics and more of that in life.
The fruits of your mushrooms. Very good. Very good.
I don't know if it keeps me young.
I'm going to really regret saying this, but I watch Mr. Beast or Sidemen Among Us videos on YouTube, so I can be down with some of the lingo with kids, and I've just probably tarnished both those individuals' brands, so I apologise for
Well done, Parmjit.
In lockdown, we got worn down by our kids and got a cockapoo. Which and I think the cockapoo identifies as a human. Actually.
All right.
But walking the dog, and obviously listening to LBC.
Oh, superb! You can always come back.
He needs a job.
What I don't do is I just don't really think about my age, and I don't obsess about my age, and I slightly pull back when people say to me, "Oh, it's your age, or it's my age, or I'm feeling this way because of our age." I just think get on with life, be busy, have a lot of political discussions.
Absolutely, this keeps us young. What a fantastic panel we've had. It was at one point I thought anarchy was going to break out. Really lively discussion. Thank you very much indeed to Joanne Nadler, Parmjit Dhanda, Jonathan Gullis, and Mandu Reid for joining us this evening and for such a lively and wonderful discussion. Coming up next. Now, this is a very interesting move because Labour is thinking about appointing a diversity czar in the hope of encouraging more women, ethnic minorities and those from working class backgrounds to stand for office for not just their own party but for all political parties and at all levels. And this also applies to public positions as well, not just political positions. This external advisor will work at the heart of the Labour government. Angela Rayner is championing this out of the Cabinet Office, and she's going to get the Electoral Commission involved. And the question I've got for you is this: do you think this will actually work, and are you supportive of it? I think it's worth discussing. Coming up next, 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the US Coast Guard says the operation to find a missing submersible which went down to see the Titanic remains a search and rescue mission. The 5 people on board may have less than 20 hours of breathable air left. Officials still don't know where noises that were picked up are coming from, but they're using that information in searches. Former Royal Navy officer Rear Admiral Chris Parry thinks focusing on them could be a mistake.
Titan was going down to Titanic. That's where she was going. That's where you start your search and you expand it out in circles. And I'm really worried in case these spurious sounds may actually be taking people away from where Titan might be.
Well, speaking earlier, Captain Jamie Frederick from the US Coast Guard says the UK Navy is now also assisting with the search.
We asked for some additional subsurface support and